there's ways to set policies in terms of, here's how we're going to do it, here's what we want you to share, here's what's voluntary, here's what's not voluntary, here's norms. At least you know the context of what you share in the office, which would be very different than how you might share a medical conversation in the context of your healthcare provider. So I think this idea of one is probably never going to happen and probably shouldn't happen.
And, changing notions about what is even information and data. I mean, it sort of comes into that conversation too, right? I mean, where we're not even going to discuss the 1,000 people that Mark is not speaking to in email. But, the notion that we can now materialize our social networks in different ways also starts to suggest there are patterns of information that emerge that I don't think we yet quite know how to make sense of in a symbolic way. I mean, I think, we knew when we were in school who liked us and who didn't, judged by who was around us, and you could kind of guess who was popular or not in those kind of ways. I suspect there's a whole new set of symbolic and sort of in some ways very metaphoric ways that this all plays out that become interesting too, because I'm not sure you can apply some of the more rational tools to that. It's not about, does this social network make me more efficient? Does this social network, make me more plugged in? Well, how would we start to measure that? And then there's this really interesting flip side. I was listening to someone talk about visiting a home recently and having someone talk to us about her content practices, and she said she suddenly had TiVo guilt, where she felt bad that the box had all these things that she should be watching and she wasn't doing it. And she felt like she was being, I mean, Mark obviously suffers from none of these things.
There is
no Twitter guilt.
I have TiVo guilt.
But, this notion that there were suddenly a whole lot of other things that we were obligated to and places that we now let down was a really interesting kind of, not necessarily good, but an interesting evolution of sort of what did it mean to feel bad that you weren't watching everything the box thought you should. So,
another example of that, and I bet you most people have had this experience, of actually working at something on your computer that is important and needs prioritising and requires your full attention, but then feeling this obligation, almost an addictive one, to check your emails every 3 minutes because something amazingly important might have come in and it never has.
Well, it's a dopamine addiction. I mean, they're starting to understand now that there's an actual addictive process that's happening in your brain. There is a reward response. Think about when you hear the little bing, it's Pavlov's dogs all over again. And we're starting to understand that, in fact, all of these cues are actually, they've worked their way really deep into us, and that's one reason why we're back and checking off.
It's a reward response without the reward.
Well, sometimes there's a reward. Then that's the problem, is that when you get that kind of reward that's infrequent, it actually strengthens the response.
But that comes back to policy settings, though, right? You talk about this kind of Pavlov dog thing. You don't have to have those things on, right? So again, it's back to the proper use of the tools that are in place, right? But you keep it on
because it's reinforcing the addiction, and this is the thing. People have to be made conscious of those relationships, and generally they aren't.
Now I'm looking forward to this question because this bloke laughed loud at something I said before earlier, so it's going to be good. And he's off again, which is excellent.
It's another question from Twitter from the lovely Susan from Gartner, who says that far from email being dead, she's sick and tired of people sending her emails when actually they could solve it with a phone call in 30 seconds. So to what extent do we need to look backwards as well as looking forwards when we're trying to solve these problems?
That's a very good question.
So I reckon one of the most interesting things that's happened over the last 10 years is watching how we stabilised our relationships to our mobile phones. So think about 10 years ago when mobile phones were just starting to hit a kind of ubiquity in Australia, and they came out on every table and every meal we ever went to and every pub. And I think we've kind of gotten to a point where we don't do that in quite the same level. And we've gone, well, maybe you don't. Most people I've spent time with, they've got to a point where they can put it away now.
You haven't seen this guy.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I know more about him now than I did 5 minutes ago. And my sense is, it goes back to this notion of we kind of evolve our relationships to things, and as devices become a little less sexy and a little more prevalent, the need to have them constantly on display kind of, stabilizes a bit. And my sense with things like email is we're still going through a period of it being, even though to all of us I suspect it's incredibly tedious and dull, there's still a way where it's just a little bit easier than making a phone call. And my sense is when I look at some of the work I'm seeing in the US, some of the stuff I'm starting to see around new cultures of innovation, it really is about actually going back to being physically co-present. God forbid, it turns out actually being in the same place with someone much easier to communicate most things. And again, we'll just say Mark notwithstanding, there's a whole lot of stuff that is much easier to communicate when you're physically co-present, and there's a re-privileging of that starting to happen in certain places, which I think is really interesting.
But it's also, isn't it, about being aware yourself and asking yourself, what's the most appropriate way to make this conversation, to have this communication? Is this something that's appropriate just for an email? Should there be face-to-face contact here because we're talking about some sort of before? Look, you can at least pay attention when we're answering your question. Talking about appropriateness of communication. What do you guys reckon? Anyway.
The audience begging for more information.
Really? Well, you've got them in the palm of your hand. Come on up. Yeah, go on.
I think part of it's also that, in fact, a phone call it requires commitment. It's a deep commitment, and email is very sort of light. You know?
Yeah, who hasn't picked up the phone and dialed a number thinking, please don't answer? Yeah, good. Now I tried to call you, but...
Voicemail.
Yeah.
Yes.
By the way, you're sacked, unfortunately. I wanted to communicate this. Yes. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think the trend...
appropriateness of it's not the device,
I mean, the trend
it's the
clearly
person.
shows that revenues, for example, from data usage are continuing to increase, you know, and so are smartphone shipments. So in terms of like going to the Wayback Machine, the Wayback Machine on either email or email usage and inbox, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now what I want to do finally is, have we got time for one more question, Brian? I think we have. Yes.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious, just a little bit curious, and it's a bit hard given the panel, that whether or not the use or just the cry and the rally that email is dead actually comes a little bit from the world that says there's this great divide between the corporation and the individual. So, you know, we see lots of examples where people are turning their backs on things that the corporation represents or that represent the corporation. I was talking to someone here the other days in this crowd about the cloud, and Microsoft has started using the word the cloud. And I put my hand up and said, I think that's the end of the cloud, because once Microsoft says we all own it, no one wants anything to do with it. And so I wonder if email's the same thing. I wonder if email actually, for many people, represents the corporation. You know, and I know, look, RIM, you know, Adele, struggle a little bit with this, around trying to bring your devices, which very much stand for, you know, the corporation and the enterprise, down into the more personal, sort of nebulous market. So I'm just wondering what the view on this, particularly Genevieve, you know, the
one for the anthropologist.
view on this. Yeah, I mean, is that what's pushing it?
I mean, I suspect that's part of it. I have to say, I spent the better part of last year hanging out in South Australia doing field work, and one of the things I was really struck by when I was actually talking to people who weren't in the tech industry was that email had become this really interesting kind of cover-all for everything. People said, well, you know, I've sent you email, and email could mean I've sent you a URL, I've sent you a photo, I've sent you a clipping of something I think you should read, which sounds suspiciously like my mother sticking newspaper clippings in, you know, envelopes and sending them to me with no other commentary on them, so it was very familiar. But email had become this kind of touch-all for anything that happened in the digital world. And I was really interested as I was listening to consumers, not technologists, talk about email, where there was no sense of it being necessarily, in fact, any different from Facebook, which was fascinating, right? It had become this kind of, it had really become a kind of a cover-all for many things that were about digital correspondence. And I was struck similarly when you think about, and maybe it sort of supports your point, Adele, when I think about SMS traffic and when you think about phone call traffic, if you analyse the data patterns there, most, like 50% or 60% of phone calls are less than 30 seconds. Most text messages are incredibly simple. They don't encode a lot of information, and they are normally things like, where are you? I miss you, still looking for you. And so, you know, thinking about those as being less about kind of more traditional dense communication acts and really being about a kind of social form of touch, right? I mean, it's all about sort of incessantly kind of reconfiguring social communications. And I think, you know, the way consumers think about email is often nowhere near as burdensome as it is in the office, because it is about all this other stuff.
Anyone, anything to that? There's a question down there.
There's a very clear
Just hold on one
differentiation.
thing. Yep.
If you ask an 18-year-old, thinks of email as work. All right, when the email as we think of it is that's work. Sending all the messages, sending 1,000 messages on Facebook a day, they don't think of that as email. There's the differentiation.
Yeah.
Sometimes be called it anyway, which I'm really interested by.
Yeah,
So I've heard people
yeah.
talk about, you know, I sent email on Facebook, and you're thinking that's a really interesting kind of slippage between the terms.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just off the back of that, I think email is the corporate problem, and I agree that young kids socially don't see it as a chore. So with corporations, what responsibility did they have to educate and enable people to manage email well? One of the things that I see consulting to a lot of larger corporations is the electronic calendar, which is very much hand in hand with email. There are very much some protocols in place and expectations about how